Part 1.
You will hear an extract from a radio programme for people who live abroad.
Look at questions 1 to 7. Now we shall begin. You should answer the questions as you listen, because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 7.
You're listening to Expat News, a weekly broadcast for the English-speaking community in this great city. In today's programme, we'll be hearing from Tom O'Hara, who's going to tell us about all those different associations you can join. Tom.
Good evening. Yes, in a city with so many of its residents born outside the country, it's hardly surprising there's such a huge range of expatriate clubs and societies. And many of these, of course, are aimed at English speakers. So, first and perhaps most obviously, we have the sports clubs, which in some cases field teams in things like rugby and tennis that compete against clubs in other parts of the country or even abroad. You don't have to play at this level to have fun, though. They can be just a great way to do some exercise and, of course, to get to know other people, especially if you're new in town. The same can be said of the many hobby and interest clubs that have sprung up here. Everything from landscape photography, such as the Viewfinders Club in the Harbour District, or Focus on the Airport Road, to old favourites like stamp collecting. Remember that this country has a long tradition of unusual and perhaps even eccentric societies, so there should be something for everyone. A place where you can meet people of different nationalities with the same social and/or cultural interests as you. For those who may be interested in rather more than just friendship, there's a wide range of lively social clubs. Several singles associations organise dancing of various kinds, while for people in a real hurry, there's speed dating, in which everyone talks to everyone else for just 5 minutes. Then, at the end, they decide which of them they would like to meet again by ticking their names on a list. In complete contrast to these are the many religious associations, reflecting the diversity of faith groups present in this multicultural city. Many of them, of course, have their own places of worship. Perhaps also of interest to those who've come here from other parts of the world are the international and cultural societies. These often provide a meeting place for people from a specific country, China, for instance, and particular ethnic groups, such as Afro-Caribbeans. As in other major cities, we have here local branches of many charities with names familiar around the world. Meetings of human rights organisations like Amnesty International are held regularly in English, as are those of environmental groups such as Greenpeace. All funds raised, by the way, go to the same kinds of good cause as they do in other countries you may have lived in. Inevitably, perhaps, there are also the political clubs, often connected with a particular party and, indeed, a particular country. So we have, for example, a local association of Republicans linked to and campaigning for that party in the US, and Liberal Democrats here doing the same for their party in Britain. Finally, on a lighter note, there's plenty to choose from in the performing arts. Whether you enjoy taking part or just watching and listening, you can take your pick from a whole range of groups. To take just a couple of examples, there's light opera at the Memorial Hall in the city centre, or a very lively amateur theatre company in the Park District. In summer, they give open-air performances of Shakespeare plays, free of charge.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, in the exam you will have 20 seconds to look at questions 8 to 10. Now listen carefully and answer questions 8 to 10.
I should mention at this point that clearly some districts have a higher concentration of English-speaking clubs than others, and that certain parts of town tend to specialise in particular activities. An obvious example would be the number of water sports clubs down near the river. Whatever the number, though, they usually have one thing in common. With the exception of a few associations linked to particular countries and supported by their embassies here, in the vast majority of cases, it is the individual members who fund them, so an entry fee or a subscription will be charged. You may be used to council-subsidised sports centres and the like in your home country, but I'm afraid that's not the case here. Assuming you can afford it then, you can be fairly sure that somewhere out there you'll find a club that caters for your own particular fascination. If it's very important to you and you intend to spend a lot of time on it, it might even determine which district of the city you decide to live in. In the unlikely event that you really can't find such a club, the solution is to try to persuade friends and anyone else you meet of the need for one. You could also use the local small ads on the internet to suggest the idea. You'll be amazed at just how many people share even the strangest interest. Then you can start your own.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2.
Part 2.
You will hear two students and their tutor discussing a survey project.
First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 16. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 16.
So, what's the survey about, Tom?
It's about where students want to live and how they choose. Basically, their accommodation preferences. We've actually tried it out with a few students already.
OK, that sounds fine. So, to start with, how many questions have you got? 20?
Is that too many?
Yes, it is, really. People get fed up answering lots of questions and they stop thinking about their answers.
Right, so we need to think about that again. What do you think of the first 3 questions?
You want to know what affects students' choice of accommodation when they go to university?
Yes, we want to find out which has the most effect. The cost, the number of rooms in the house or flat, or the distance from campus.
And then we asked another question.
Oh, yes? What else did you want to find out?
Well, we wondered whether public transport was important. You know, not many students have cars, so it might be quite important for them to be near somewhere where they could catch a bus or train.
Yeah, that's a good question. Before you ask any more people, I've got a couple of suggestions for improving the questionnaire. First of all, I think you need to ask fewer questions. As I said, 20 is really too many. I'd cut it down to 10 if I were you.
Okay, 10 questions only. And is there anything else you think we should do?
Well, yes. Some of the questions are actually quite complicated. I think you should make them clearer. I think they should be easier to understand.
And what do you think about asking more questions about cost?
No, I don't think you need any more about cost. But you could ask a couple more questions about the reasons for students' decisions.
So we should ask some more questions with why?
Yes, I think you'd get quite a lot more information if you did that.
Thank you.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 17 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 17 to 20.
We've already got some results from our first questionnaire. Do you think we could use them?
I don't see why not. What have you found out so far?
Well, the number of rooms was only important for 16% of the people we asked. It looks like a lot of students are quite happy to share a room, and even fewer people were concerned about being near a bus stop, only 10% in fact.
I'm surprised about that. But what about the distance from the university?
Well, that was quite important. Around 20% of the students we asked wanted to be close to campus.
That makes sense. And what about the cost?
Yeah, as we expected, the cost was by far the most important factor. More than half the students were concerned with the cost, 54% to be exact.
Only 54%? I thought it would be closer to 80%.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3.
Part 3.
You will hear a dialogue between two students, David and Jim.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 24. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 24.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, David. I'm glad I found you. I've got a topic for our presentation next month.
What is it?
I thought it would be a good idea to talk about glass and how it's recycled.
That doesn't sound very interesting.
That's what I thought, but it is. Did you know that glass has been around since as early as 4000 BC, when glass was used in the Middle East as a glaze to decorate beads?
Is it really that old?
Yes, and by 1550 BC, coloured glass vessels were widespread and used for cooking and drinking. The earliest known clear glass is a vase found in Nineveh in Assyria, dated from around 800 BC, which is now in the British Museum here in London.
You know, I think I've seen that. I was at the British Museum a couple of months ago with Lisa.
We don't realise how valuable glass was. It wasn't used widely back then. Until the 18th and 19th centuries, glass was very expensive and was used for limited applications, such as stained glass windows for churches. Large-scale glass manufacturing began with the Industrial Revolution, with the mass production of glass containers beginning at the onset of the 20th century, and glass light bulb production automated in 1926.
How expensive?
I don't know. But nowadays glass is much less expensive and is taken for granted as a packaging material, in addition to its use in windows and other applications.
Do you know what glass is made from?
New glass is made from a mixture of 4 main ingredients: sand, soda ash, limestone and other additives. These additives include iron for colour, brown or green, chromium and cobalt for colour, green and blue respectively, lead to alter the refractive index, alumina for durability, and boron to improve the thermal options. Annually, total glass use in the UK is estimated at around 3.6 million tonnes.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 25 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 25 to 30.
You're kidding. That's phenomenal. What do we do with all that glass? Where does it go?
Using present technology, the UK glass industry has the capacity to recycle over 1 million tonnes of glass each year. And this, coupled with the material's unique ability to be infinitely recycled without compromising its quality, creates a compelling case for the recycling of glass. Despite this, glass makes up around 7% of the average household dustbin, and last year over 2.5 million tonnes of this material was landfill.
How can glass be recycled?
It can be recycled indefinitely as part of a simple but hugely beneficial process, as its structure does not deteriorate when reprocessed, In the case of bottles and jars, up to 80% of the total mixture can be made from reclaimed scrap glass, called cullet.
What's it called?
Cullet. C-U-L-L-E-T. Cullet from a factory has a known composition and is recognised as domestic cullet. From bottle banks it is known as foreign, and its actual properties will not be known. Recycling 2 bottles saves enough energy to boil water for 5 cups of tea.
You know, I wouldn't mind a cuppa now.
Did you know that recycling reduces the demand for raw materials? There is no shortage of the materials used, but they do have to be quarried from our landscape. So from this point of view, there are environmental advantages to recovering and recycling glass. For every tonne of recycled glass used, 1.2 tonnes of raw materials are preserved. Recycling also reduces the amount of waste glass which needs to be used as landfill.
I know. It's a social conscience we all need to have.
Taking part in recycling the waste we produce makes us think about the effects we are having on our environment and enables us to contribute towards a greater level of sustainability. It's not all about economics, you know.
I'm sure you're right, Jim.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4.
Listen to the continuation of the lecture about the human brain. Look at the diagram before you listen.
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
OK, we have looked at the top view of the brain and seen how it is divided into lobes. Now we are going to look at a more complex diagram of the centre of the brain. I will briefly go through some of the important parts that make up the brain and then talk more about what each does. First of all, you can see that by far the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum, and it is made up of the 3 lobes we have already talked about. The lobe below, coloured yellow on the diagram here, is the cerebellum. Right in the centre of the brain here is the thalamus. The hypothalamus is part of it, but it has a slightly different function. Now here, running down from the centre of the brain, is the brain stem. It is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, and is connected to the spinal cord, which you can see here at the bottom of the diagram. Now, finally, this little gland just to the left of the midbrain, it looks like a little tail, is the pituitary gland. OK, let's go back and say something about the function of the various parts of the brain. The cerebrum, the largest part, as we have said, has 2 halves or hemispheres. I will talk more about the difference between the 2 hemispheres later. The cerebrum is the part of the brain that is really our intelligence. It controls voluntary movement, that is, movement that we are in control of, speaking, for example. But it is also responsible for our emotional thinking and memory. The cerebellum is responsible for fine movement and coordination. It helps us with balance, for example, and to understand where we are in relation to space around us. The thalamus, here in the centre, processes what we feel with our body, touch and temperature, for example, and controls how we react to those senses. The hypothalamus has a similar function, but regulates bodily needs, such as hunger and thirst, and tells us when we need sleep. Now, at the top of the brainstem is the midbrain. This is a sort of switchboard, a very complex switchboard. It sends messages which help the brain communicate with other parts of the nervous system. The pons in the middle of the brainstem here sends messages from the cerebrum to the cerebellum and spinal cord. The medulla oblongata is here just above the spinal cord. It regulates essential bodily functions, like breathing and the rate of our heartbeat. The spinal cord is part of the central nervous system and runs down inside the spinal column. It connects the brain to nerves that go to the rest of the body. Now, the pituitary gland, this little gland, has a hugely important function. It releases hormones to the body that regulate all sorts of things. How quickly we grow, and the size we grow to, the rate at which we age. It also regulates whether we have a slow or fast metabolism and how we relate to stress. Now I am going to show you a model of the human brain, and I want you to identify...
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.